This is called 23andMe and Lance. I'm sitting in my cubicle at work and I get a Facebook message from a stranger named Kelsey Weber. She says, I'm here with my dad and he just got his 23andMe results back. If you aren't familiar with 23andMe, it's a DNA research and analysis company. My dad gifted me a membership account for Christmas 5 years ago. The website sent me a little vial which I filled with saliva and sent back to them. They analyzed my DNA sample and were able to tell me things like where my ancestors came from. Turns out I'm 98.4% Northwestern European. How prone to certain physical traits I am. I'll likely have little upper back hair. What my level of health risks are. 1.35 times more likely than the average white male to experience atrial fibrillation in my lifetime, which sucks, but it's somewhat offset by the fact that I'm half as likely to experience multiple sclerosis. And finally, 23andMe.com shows me everyone else on the website I share DNA with and exactly how much DNA I share with that person. For reference, my late father and I shared 47.6% of my DNA. That's a lot. I have a first cousin once removed on the website, Cam, and he shares 5.59% of my DNA, which is still a relatively good chunk considering all but 5 of the rest of the 1,191 people I share DNA with on the website share less than 1%. But now here's this Kelsey Weber sending me a Facebook message about how her dad was adopted in 1965 in Evansville, Indiana, and has spent the last 17 years looking for his biological family with no success until 23andMe just told him he shares DNA with Guy Choate. I get a lot of spam on Facebook, and I initially think this might be spam, but sure enough, there's Lance on my list of relatives. We share 7.56% DNA, the most anyone on the site shared with me, with the exception of my father. It says we are likely first cousins, but my oldest aunt or uncle would have been 13 in 1965 and probably not bearing children. I text Liz, who speculates about who in my family Lance might belong to. She is trapped at home with her 1-month-old son, Gus, and she's eager for interaction. She tells me to tell her anything as soon as I find out. She tells me Gus has peed on her 3 times today. I email Lance to introduce myself, and I say I'm open to uncovering the details of exactly how we came to share so much DNA. I tell him I don't know of anyone in my family with ties to Indiana, but if he tells me what he knows so far, I will do my best to fill some holes in for him. I apologize to him for emailing rather than calling, but talking on the phone gives me anxiety, and I think to myself, what kind of lunatic he must think I am for saying such things. After all this man knows about me is my 23andMe profile picture, which I put up as a kind of joke in case this exact scenario ever came about. I look like a real-life version of the dude from My Name is Earl. While waiting on Lance's email response, I click around on his 23andMe profile and find his list of DNA relatives. I recognize some of the names of strangers on his list that are also on mine, but there are 2 important names on my list that are not on his. Lance shares no DNA with my father, meaning I must be related to him on my mother's side of the family. The other name missing from his list is Cam's, and Cam is my maternal grandfather's nephew, meaning that Lance and I must share DNA from my mother's side of the family. We call my grandmother Anna. I open my family tree on Ancestry.com and look at the birth years of my grandmother's 5 brothers and sisters. My great-uncle Johnny was born in 1946, and he would have been 18 years old in January of 1965 when Lance was born. My inbox dings with the arrival of Lance's response. He tells me what the state of Indiana has told him, that his biological family lived in Arkansas, and his mom traveled to Evansville, Indiana to stay at a home for unwed mothers before giving birth to him, that his mother and father were both 18 years old and had just graduated high school. He doesn't know their names, but his mother was the youngest of 4, and his father had 5 siblings. His father's family ran a dairy farm. Reading the information reminds me of a conversation I had with Nana a couple of years ago. I asked her what her first memory was, and she told me about when she was 2 or 3 years old, and they lived in an old house in Hickory Plains, which is a tiny farm community in Perry County. My 95-year-old great-grandmother, Mimi, still lives there. Nana said she remembered running in the middle of the night from that old house to the dairy barn because the storm was so bad, and the dairy barn had a more sturdy foundation. The dairy barn had always been in the background of stories I grew up hearing about Nana's family, but for Lance, it was always very much in the foreground, as it was one of the only pieces of information he had about his biological father. I don't know who your mother is, I write to him, but I think I know your dad. I tell Lance I don't feel comfortable revealing his father's name or contact information until I have a chance to talk to him first. Lance insists on nothing less. That night, I call my mother. I want to know if Johnny having a son in Indiana is something the family knows but doesn't talk about. Mom is the oldest grandchild, and her mother's brothers and sisters, who are all still alive and well, have doted on her for nearly 60 years. If anyone from her generation knows about such a thing as a long-lost son in Indiana, it will be Mom. But when I call her, she says she knows nothing about it. What are you going to do, she asks. I suppose I'm going to call Uncle Johnny. Well, don't do it in the next couple of days, she says. It's his birthday and all his children will be with him. Johnny has 6 other children, one 8 months younger than Lance. Wait a few days, Mom says. I tell her I will. What are you going to say when you call him, Liz asks. I've been thinking about it, and not a lot else. Johnny is a lifelong car salesman. He possesses a quick wit and what we call the gift of gab. Johnny is extremely likable. He was the first person on that side of the family to meet Liz because we ran into him one afternoon at the horse races shortly after we began dating. Sweetheart, he says to Liz, if you want to make some money today, you'll bet on that number 7 horse. He followed it up with another joke or two and then made his way to the betting window. Liz liked him immediately. Everyone likes him. I tell her I'm going to call Johnny and share with him the facts I've been given. It's simple as that. What do you think he's going to say? Liz says. I think he's going to say, well, damn, guy. How about that? I would almost bet a little money on those exact words if I would have found a bookie willing to take it. And I would have bet the house on his owning up to the fact that he had a son born in 1965. But when I call him and give him the facts, then follow up with, Uncle John, does that sound like anybody you know? He says, sounds like a whole bunch of people I know. A whole bunch of families around here that have dairy farms. He tells me he'll think about it some more and get back with me if anyone comes to mind. Over the next few days, I try to come up with a reason why Uncle John would play dumb to the idea that he has a kid that was given up for adoption years ago. Johnny has 6 other children by 2 different mothers, and he's married to a third. There is no stereotypically all-American family image to uphold within the family. Johnny's kids have had multiple children of their own over the course of multiple marriages. They've made plenty of mistakes and aren't ashamed of them. His kids are not shy on life experience, and no matter what one is going through, the others always not only seem tolerant, but supportive. Johnny has no reason to fear how his 6 kids would react to the introduction of a 7th because they will support him endlessly, just as they do each other. I email Lance to say I think I must have caught Johnny off guard, but that he is a good man, that he will come around. 52 years is a long time to bury a secret, so it's normal to doubt it on the day it resurfaces. Lance says he isn't surprised Johnny reacted this way, but I feel like there's disappointment in those words. There has to be. Because isn't that the dream? That after a lifetime of wondering who and where your biological parents are, you will find them and they will say, there you are, thank God. This has all been such a huge mistake. I can't believe you let me get away. But that's just a dream. Reality is more complicated. There is a reason Johnny and Lance's biological mother put him up for adoption in 1965, and in the last 52 years, they have taught themselves to live a life without him. Whatever guilt, whatever pain that came with that little baby into the world, that baby that has since grown into a man, had to be overcome so that life could go on for Johnny and Lance's mother. Otherwise, it would have destroyed them. It's human instinct to do what we have to do to survive, and Lance understands that. What did Lance say in his email when he told them, Liz asked? He said it's okay, that he's just glad to know I'm his family. He told me I'm only the 3rd blood relative he's ever known. Wait, Liz says, I thought he didn't know any of his biological family. He has 2 daughters, I say. Liz tears up at the sad undertone of such a reality. We have to help him, she says. We are, I say, and we will. Lance wants to talk on the phone, but I can't do it. Yes, there's my phone anxiety, but I also don't trust myself on the phone. I still haven't told Lance his father's name, and I'm afraid if he asks me in real time for it, I won't hesitate to tell him, which might be perceived as a betrayal of my uncle's confidence, and I don't want that. And so I continue to email with Lance. He tells me about Tammy, his wife of 32 years. He tells me about Kelsey and Courtney, his 2 grown daughters. He tells me about his professional life. He sells resins and other treatments to commercial clients, and he makes a good living at it. He tells me that writing emails gives him anxiety, just like talking on the phone gives me anxiety. He tells me he's trying to be patient with all of this, but now that he's so close to discovering his family, he's having a hard time with patience. He tells me he's grateful for my willingness to help him, but he is eager to know if he has siblings, nieces, nephews, if they are healthy, if they are happy. I struggle with how much to tell him. I want to tell him everything, but again, I feel hemmed in by what might be considered a betrayal of trust. I wrestle with how to respond to those questions as I lie in bed, desperate for sleep, knowing Gus will wake up soon, ready for nursing and a diaper change. I need to sleep, but I won't be able to until I respond to those questions. So I get up and tiptoe into the dining room. I open my laptop. For nearly 3 hours, I compose and revise an email to Lance. I use real names, then I use fake names, then I delete it all and start over, again and again. And finally, the lack of sleep gets to me, and I tell him about how Nana remembers running to the dairy barn as a little girl, and how Uncle Johnny had a car dealership for a while, and Lance's grandmother is still alive, though her mental health has begun to deteriorate. I tell him how loving and accepting everyone is, and how they will accept him. If not now, then soon, I just know it. I tell him to go to my photo a day blog and do a search for Walters, and all the people that show up in those pictures are the family he was born to. I tell him I'll call in the next couple of days, and also to please forgive me if I should have handled any of this differently. I send the email, I change Gus's diaper, and then I collapse into bed. In the morning, there's an email from Lance. He says the email is perhaps the most entertaining he's ever read. But I'm still nervous to call him a couple of days later. He answers the phone with a playful, "Hey, cuz." He doesn't sound like what I thought he would sound like, though I had no idea what I thought he would sound like. Maybe I thought he would sound like Johnny's other son Brandon, but he doesn't. Lance doesn't pull words from his mouth in the way they do. Maybe he would if he grew up in rural Arkansas instead of southern Indiana. We talk for an hour and a half in what is the longest telephone conversation I've had in years. He tells me the email I agonized over for 3 hours, doing my best not to reveal too much. I actually didn't tell him much more than he already deduced by cross-referencing my public Ancestry.com profile with my photo a day blog, which he found on his own before Kelsey ever reached out to me. 2 hours after getting the DNA results, he came across a photo on my blog of Johnny, and upon seeing it, Lance's wife gasped, "That's your arm," she said. "That guy's your dad." And she was right. He wanted to tell me he already knew these things, but he didn't want to scare me off. Lance reiterates to me on the phone about how even if no one else in the family ever accepts him, he's happy to know me and Liz and Gus. He doesn't want to disrupt Johnny's life or the lives of Johnny's other children, but at the very least, he wants some information from him. At 52 years old, Lance is beginning to develop some potential health risks, and his doctors need family medical history in order to provide the best care. And also, Lance wants to know who his mother is. I'm worried she might have a lot of guilt because of my adoption, he said. I imagine a lot of guilt comes with putting a baby up for adoption, I say. It's not just that she put me up for adoption, it says, it's that she tried not to. Lance tells me his mother changed her mind about putting him up for adoption according to the state of Indiana. The adoption was lined up so that on the day he was born, he would immediately have a family. But when that day finally came, his biological mother refused to give her baby up. In fact, she refused for 10 days until her parents drove back up from Arkansas to Indiana and forced her to turn over the baby. If that's true, Lance says, then she's probably carrying around a lot of guilt. I'd like to find her and hug her and tell her she didn't do anything wrong, that I've had a good life, that I'm okay. Lance has scoured Facebook to study as much as he can about his half-siblings. He knows more about them than I do, and I grew up seeing them on holidays and at the occasional Sunday lunch at Mimi's. Lance has seen a video of Johnny at a recent family gender reveal party. He has heard his dad's voice, he says. He talks about it like somebody talks about hanging out with someone famous. I can only imagine how many times he's watched that clip of Johnny. Liz and I are planning to take a trip to Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which will pretty much be ground zero for watching the solar eclipse on August 21st. It's only another 90 minutes or so from Hopkinsville to Newburgh, Indiana, where Lance lives. Before I get off the phone, he invites us to spend the weekend with him and his family, and I accept. I tell him that after we meet, I'll try to talk to Johnny again, armed with the humanizing information that Lance and his family welcomed me and my family into their home. During the weeks leading up to our visit, Lance combs the internet for photos of Johnny in high school to compare them to photos of himself during high school. I text him when I find from Johnny's class of 1964 yearbook. It's Johnny and the 3 of his female classmates. Their names are captioned below the photo. "Call me," Lance messages in response. I do. "My adopted mother saw my birth certificate once, right when I was born," he says. "She wasn't supposed to see it, but she did. She told me when I was born, my birth mother gave me the name Brian Nichols. The girl standing in front of Johnny in that picture you just sent is named Carolyn Nichols. I think that's my mom." Over the next 24 hours, Lance sends me photos of himself placed beside photos he's found of Carolyn Nichols in old yearbooks. There was a resemblance in the eyebrow line. Lance sends me the letter the state of Indiana sent regarding his parents. It says the stuff about the dairy and his dad's 5 brothers and sisters. It says his dad weighed 135 pounds and had blue eyes. I print the letter out and take it to Nana. She reads it. What do you think about that, Nana? Nana's poker face is flawless. What do you think about that? She asked me. I think that letter's describing my Uncle Johnny. She looks down at the letter again before saying, that wouldn't surprise me. We talk about other things for a while, about Gus's sleeping habits, about how cute he is, before I steer the conversation back to the letter. Nana, you don't know who that girl might be? The letter says she was demure, pretty, worked in the local grocery store. I know who it is, she says confidently. Are you going to tell me who it is? I ask. No, she says. Johnny needs to do that. That's a decision he needs to make. There's a pregnant pause during which I admire Nana's wisdom. What should I do? I ask her. You should talk to Johnny again and show him this letter. Newburgh is just east of Evansville in southern Indiana, across the Ohio River from Kentucky. Lance and Tammy live on a quiet street in a middle-class neighborhood. It's a single-level home with a well-manicured yard. Lance steps from the front of the house as I park Liz's Subaru, and he embraces me in a hug. In photos, Lance looked more like his grandfather, my great-grandfather. But in person, he looks more like Johnny. They have the same shape, 5'10"-ish, strong arms, round in the middle. Inside, we meet Tammy and Kelsey's husband, Jared. There's the awkwardness of not knowing exactly what to do. We stand around the kitchen and dining room talking about the drive and how Gus slept most of the way, until slowly the awkwardness fades. Lance and I mostly repeat the things we talked about on the phone, but now we're doing it for the benefit of everyone now in the room, so they know the parts of this journey they've missed. The next day, Lance's brother Dirk and his family come over. Dirk was also adopted and also recently reunited with his biological family. Lance and Tammy drag out old photos of when the 2 brothers were little boys. And then there are the photos from when Lance and Tammy were just starting their own family. Their girls are little. In those photos from the 90s, Lance looks like Brandon, his half-brother. When the weekend is over, Lance wants us to stay. He's gotten attached to Gus, and he's happy when Gus's diaper change delays our departure, and then Gus's appetite delays our departure. And finally, we decide there is no point in trying to get to Hopkinsville to see the eclipse. Instead, we put a blanket down for Gus to lie on in the back of Lance's truck in the garage, and we stand out in the driveway with our eclipse glasses on, and we stare up at the sun like thousands of other families across the globe. I don't want to call Johnny again. I don't know what to say. I don't want to hound him. I have too much respect for him to do that. I don't want him to think I'm hassling him. I don't want to make things awkward at family gatherings, but I know without a doubt that Lance is his son, and I know our family raised me to help people when there is an opportunity, and this is clearly an opportunity. I walk our dog Suki through our North Little Rock neighborhood, trying to muster the courage to pull myself from my pocket to call Johnny, but instead I find myself brainstorming alternatives. There is a photo of Lance that Dirk uploaded to Facebook months ago. The photo gives details about the search and the information about the biological father's family. It has around 2,000 shares. I think if I can just get one of Johnny's kids to see that photo, they will get curious and figure it out for themselves. That way I wouldn't have to tell anyone anything and be absolved of any responsibility. But I decided that is disingenuous and cowardly, and abandon the idea. I call Lance. What if I talk to Uncle Gary, Johnny's brother? I ask. Gary knows Johnny better than I ever will. He will know what to say. Lance can hear the anxiety in my voice. He says, you know what, you have a new baby at home and you need to be concentrating on that. I never meant to cause you this much stress. You've been so generous with your time and efforts, and I'll always be thankful. You've done enough, guy. Why don't you let me call Johnny myself and talk to him? It is tempting. I feel liberated at the very idea of turning this whole thing over to someone else. I share that feeling with Lance, and then it is decided. But very quickly, this option also begins to feel cowardly. And so I tell Lance I will talk to Gary, and if that doesn't work, then he can call Johnny himself. The next day at work, I dial my great Uncle Gary's phone number for the first time in my life. I get his voicemail and leave a message. I tell him I need to talk to him about something extremely personal in nature. I tell him I'd appreciate it if he keeps our meeting confidential, especially to his brothers and sisters. I know what a hard request that is for Gary to honor. He and his 5 siblings are extremely close. The level of coordination they employ to take care of their 95-year-old mother with dementia who insists on living at home alone is something any corporate team would envy. They arrange for someone to have coffee every morning with her. they have someone there at lunch, and they have someone always available to help her make her appointments. They are all in their 70s, with the exception of Gary, who's 69, but they utilize modern technology, a sibling group text, to stay connected. To ask Gary to keep a secret from his siblings is something I feel guilty about. But when he calls me back, he commits to telling no one of our meeting the next day, and he only asks one question. God, is this the kind of meeting I need to bring my gun to? He says it jokingly, but there's relief when I tell him no gun will be needed. The next day, I take a long lunch and drive to the car lot Gary and his brother Bill have had in habit for as long as I can remember. They keep a row of cars for sale in the gravel parking lot. Other cars are there to be repaired in one of the 3 body shop bays. The office is walled with imitation wood paneling. Bill and Johnny were at the lot just before I arrived, but Gary sent them on a mission to Mimi's house. He meets me in the parking lot and says we have plenty of time to talk. I follow him to the office. Gary is a quiet man, gentle. He is patient, but he is anxious to hear what would bring me to him on this weekday. I tell him about Lance and how he found me. I tell him all I know. Gary leans back in his metal office chair that squeaks. He looks out the large window to his right. I look at the photos on the opposite wall. They are of his family from decades ago. There is a photo, a family favorite, of his father, my great-grandfather, Lance's grandfather, toward the end of his life. The photographer, no doubt one of Gary's siblings, is positioned behind where Papa sits on a railed trailer in his ever-present overalls. He is reaching out a hand to pet the head of a heifer. There are more than 1,000 words in that picture of a man who has spent a lifetime relying upon that animal. I'd always heard rumors that something like that might have happened, Gary says, still looking out the window. Do you know who that girl is? He turns back toward me. I have a working theory, I say. Her name is Carolyn Nichols. That fits my theory, I say. Deep down, I think I doubted the theory until that moment. I thought Lance's comparison of his face to Carolyn's wasn't good enough, that he was seeing what he wanted to see. Damn it, it wasn't right. I showed Gary the letter and some photos Tammy sent home with me from Indiana. He looks at them proudly, like he is looking at his nephew's family. He looks a little like John Brennan in that one, doesn't he? I nod. And this little girl here, Gary points to Lance's daughter Courtney. At first glance, looks like Tammy. Tammy said the same thing, I say. He studies the photo silently for a long time before asking, God, what's this fellow want? He wants to look his dad in the eye, I say, and shake his hand. He wants to know where it came from. He wants to be accepted. Gary looks out the window of the lot. It's something else, isn't it? It is, I say. Well, what did my sister say when you told her? He means Nana. She said Johnny needs to make a decision. Of course, she's right. Johnny does need to make a decision. I thought I was going to call him and he was going to say, well, damn, guy, and that would be it. He'd tell me to have Lance up to Mimi's and we'd have a fish fry or something. Gary laughs and says he would have thought the same thing. I think I'm adding on my lead now, I tell him. I think I've taken this as far as I can. I'll talk to him, Gary says, and I'm flushed with relief again. I won't push him, but I'll find a good time to bring it up when it's just the two of us. He thanks me for coming to him, and I thank him for taking the baton from me. I call Lance on my way back to the office. I'm happy. I'm proud to tell him that Gary is going to make things happen. Lance is glad to know his uncle wants to meet him, but he is eager for things to happen quickly. We are both excited that Gary confirmed that Lance's mother is Carolyn Nichols. A woman Lance's sister-in-law has scoured the internet for and determined her married name is Carolyn Sullivan. She lives in Hot Springs Village. The next day, Lance calls her. He has a script he got from Dirk advising how adopted children should talk to their biological parents for the first time. The gist of it is that the parent needs to be handed the factual pieces, and then they should be allowed to put the puzzle together for themselves. Lance gave Carolyn the pieces: Indiana, Arkansas, 1965, until finally she said, I believe I'm your mother. Lance tells me she's a very sweet old lady who lives in Bryant now. The Hot Springs Village address belongs to her daughter, with whom she lived while Carolyn recovered from a car accident that left her in a wheelchair for a couple of years. His conversation with her lasted an hour and a half, during which she cries and says multiple times, I can't believe I'm talking to my baby. Carolyn wants to know when she can see Lance. She wants to drive to Indiana immediately, but Lance worries about her ability to do that given her ailing health. She has survived breast cancer, but now the disease is also attacking what is left of her one good kidney. Why don't I come to you, Lance tells her on the Wednesday before Labor Day. By Friday night, he and Tammy are sitting in my living room. The next morning, Tammy says Lance is talking a lot because he is nervous. Apparently, he inherited the gift of gab. They want to leave in time to pick up some flowers for Lance's mother, despite the long phone conversation he had with her. Lance still wonders what she will be like. I can see him protecting his feelings by preparing to be disappointed. If this doesn't go well, we might be back in time for lunch, he says. It will go well, Liz says. It hurts me to not be there. I want to see a mother reunited after 52 years with a son she never wanted to lose. I want to know how a person explains to a child what 52 years of living without them is like. My own son can barely so much as hold his head up, and I am already fearful of the important parts of his life I will miss, because I will be at work or some other unavoidable hours-long circumstance. A 52-year circumstance must feel like a death sentence for a parent. 6 hours later, Lance and Tammy return from meeting with his mother. Lance isn't talking as much. His nerves have settled a little. She just kept patting his knee, Tammy says. She told him she was sorry, and that her mom and daddy forced her to give him up. Lance nods. It's clear he's only beginning to process the day, but there is no time now because we have planned a dinner at our house with the few members of my family who know about Lance. Nana, Gary, my mother, and my Aunt Connie. They'll be at our house in a half hour. Lance and Tammy go upstairs to freshen up. I'm holding Gus to my chest as we walk our regular circuit through the house, from the nursery down the hall to the kitchen, to the office, to the formal living room, and then back to the nursery. As long as we're moving, he is happy. On our fourth lap, I look out the office's window to see Nana's van parked in our driveway. Nana, Connie, and Mom are on their way up the front steps. Nana carries a homemade cherry pie with her, a pie I requested because it's my favorite, but it's also Gary's favorite. Nana doesn't know Gary is in on the secret, despite having coffee with him earlier in the day. They both kept the information to themselves. I open the door and they all fawn over Gus. Lance and Tammy come down the stairs from the spare bedroom as Nana, Connie, and Mom greet Liz in the kitchen. I watch their faces as they each steal a glance into the den to get a peek at these new family members of ours. I extend my arms as if to make an introduction, but before I can get the words out, the two groups have merged and Nana is hugging Lance. Everyone is smiling. I pass Gus off and walk outside to call Gary, who says he will be right over. I keep an eye on the office window until I see his old Chevy pickup pull into the drive. I meet him on the porch and escort him through the house. Well, how's my closed-mouthed sister, he says. Well, looky here, Nana says. She smiles, unsure of what else to do. He made me promise not to tell Nana, I say. Gary hugs Nana and his nieces. He shakes Lance's hand and hugs Tammy and Liz. I serve wine and we sit around the den. Lance recounts all the details. The DNA, our visit to Indiana, his visit with his mother. They ask about his children and his adopted family. I have to interrupt the conversation so people will move to the kitchen. Liz and I didn't want to disrupt the natural order of conversation, but the shrimp Liz has put into the etouffee will get tough if they continue to cook in the hot liquid. For 48 hours, I've thought about how I will be expected to say a prayer before this meal, and I've wondered what to say. I am not religious, but my family is. And so I've decided to say I don't believe in God, but I do believe in being humble and giving thanks. But when the time comes, it feels contrived. So I simply say how thankful I am to have everyone at the table together, finally, because Liz and I have felt alone with the secret, that I have told Lance about how great of a family we are, and now I'm finally getting to show him. I say that Lance and Tammy will always be our family now. My mother is changing Gus's diaper during my toast, and I'm disappointed she didn't hear it, because I thought it would make her feel proud of me. And I wonder if Lance has the same desire from his birth mother, that desire to want to make her proud, even though he has only just met her. Well, Lance, Gary says when there's a lull in the conversation, what's your plan for going home? We're going to wake up, have some breakfast, and get on the road unless you have a better plan. I think I do, Gary says. Everyone looks to where he sits at the head of the rectangular table, Lance on the corner to his right. I think we've been deprived of this relationship for too long, and you've been deprived of this family for too long. You and Tammy are already here, and I think we need to go ahead and get this done. If you can stay another day, I think I can get John where we need him to be. The confidence of Gary's words charges the air with excitement, and we make a plan. Gary will talk to Johnny at Mimi's and then bring him to Nana's house, where I will bring Lance and Tammy. After 2 months of fret and worry, it all seems so simple now the way Gary says it. On Sunday morning, Liz and Gus and I go with Tammy and Lance to brunch. Afterward, we introduce them to muscadine jelly at a boutique grocery shop. They don't have muscadines in Indiana, and I think about how that might be the saddest part of this whole deal. I cannot imagine childhood without muscadines. Gary calls me. God, everything went well in this end. Johnny will be at Nana's at 4:30 this afternoon. We arrive with Lance and Tammy at 4, and naturally form a kind of circle on the couches and chairs of Nana's living room, like I am accustomed to doing at Nana's on a Sunday afternoon. But this time, seated in this arrangement, it feels slightly like an intervention. It is 4:15. Nana tells Connie to show Lance the back of the house. Nana is wise and recognizes the need to disperse. I stand up and walk to the kitchen to make some ice water. I am standing at the sink where there is a window into the sunroom through which I watch Lance standing beside Nana. They are looking toward the driveway where a car is pulled up and parked. Lance's eyes are glued to the car, the door opening, the man who has eluded him for 52 years emerging. I want to look out the window to view what Lance must be seeing, but instead I keep my eyes on him because the image is too powerful to abandon. A grown man studying his father's walk for the first time in his life. My own father spent the last part of his life tied to a bed in a wheelchair, but when I think of him now, I envision him walking. It's a walk I know so well. I can even tell you the difference in the gait he had when I was a kid versus the one he had as a middle-aged man. I suppose most of us can envision the walks of our fathers, having studied them for years without even realizing it. But this is Lance's first look at his father's, and I embrace how fortunate I am to witness him witnessing it. Lance and Tammy and their family have belonged to me and Liz and Gus. But when Uncle Johnny walks through the door, they will no longer be just ours. A selfish part of me doesn't want to let go of that, but that selfishness disappears at the joy I feel for Lance when my Uncle Johnny does exactly what I always told Lance he would do. He walks into Nana's sunroom, and without hesitation, he hugs the son he's never met. They talk of shared physical characteristics. They find humor in having gout in the same leg. Nana calls her other siblings to invite them to come meet their new nephew, and when they show up, Johnny stands proudly beside Lance and says, "This is my son." In the time that has passed since that day when we brought Johnny and Lance together, I thought a lot about what Lance must be feeling, and I keep going back to the image of him watching Johnny walk from the car. When he first saw his father, Lance said quietly, "I do look like him, don't I?" He said it to Nana, but he was telling himself as much as he was telling her. In that statement, I believe he was accepting that the search he began 17 years ago, if not 52 years ago, was finally over. That must be a surreal thing to say goodbye to. But in ending the search, he's also opening the door to an era of discovery in his life. When Lance is back in Indiana, and I am sitting in my cubicle where I was when I first got the email from Kelsey, I text him that he might one day look up and wish he had never found our family. That he may find out we're all nuts. But he says he thinks he's the same kind of nuts as we are. I suppose it's probably in those strands of DNA we share. Thank you. Thanks, man. Bye, Lance.